Okay, looks like most people have joined. So let's get started. I'm Jamal. I'm a Counterfire member in Edinburgh. Um, I'm actually not far from the grave of Adam Smith. And John Rees is gonna tell the other side of the story for us today. So John is founding member of Counterfire and a national officer at the Stop the War Coalition. And he's going to give an introduction to Marxist economics, and then we're going to have a discussion afterwards. We're going to record the introduction and then we'll turn the recording off for when we have the discussion. So over to you, John.
Okay, thanks, Jamal. So Marx wasn't an economist. In fact, the discipline of economics, which has grown up as a sub-branch of academic division of labor, wasn't really a thing when Marx was writing, certainly when Marx began writing. Marx was interested in a subject called political economy. And so were all the great classical economists, including Adam Smith and David Ricardo. So they didn't have the kind of narrow empirical focus of uh, economic study as it's developed in academia. They were interested in a much broader vision of economics, which, if it were to encompass the relevant departments in schools and universities now, would include politics and sociology and history. So that's the kind of framework that Marx brought to this subject, and it's worth saying that, and it's worth keeping that in mind because a lot of criticism of Marx, modern criticism of Marx, um, is really reduces itself to the idea that he wouldn't fit in, or latter Marxists couldn't fit in to the narrow constraints of free market economics as it developed in academia later on. And I guess one reason why that was the case, one fundamental reason why that was the case, is because the foundational idea of Marxist economics is the idea of human labor. As Marx and Engels famously put it on one occasion, that before all else, human beings have to acquire from nature food, clothing, shelter, and so forth and so on. That all human life, in no matter what age historically, depends on human beings' interaction with the naturally given world and their ability to take from it, by the exercise of human labor, those elements which are necessary for the survival of the human race. So, labor, in that sense, labor and nature are the fundamental categories of Marxist economics. And of course, the next step in Marx's kind of building block of his view of the world was to articulate the idea that in the course of this process of human labor, human beings developed various tools in order to assist them, from the first stone axe to artificial intelligence. Human beings develop various means of production, as Marx calls them, and they utilize those means of productions in order to more effectively take from the natural world or shape the natural world in such ways as provide their means of subsistence. Very early on in the development of human society, the wealth that that produces, the wealth that human labor, using means of production, produces from the natural world, produces a surplus over and above what's necessary to survive day to day. And for Marx and Engels, the entire history of class society is a battle about who will control the means of production and therefore control the surplus above and beyond the immediate needs of humanity that are produced by that mechanism, and various forms of class society embody different ways of doing that. One method of doing that was the slave societies of ancient Greece and Rome. Another way of doing that was the feudal societies based on aristocratic land ownership and the rest of the population in one way or another working the land. And of course, the version of that picture that we have is a capitalist society where the capitalists own the means of production, and the rest of society is dependent on wage labor granted by the capitalists in order in order to survive. So that is a those are very general features of class society, but they're fundamental. Those building blocks, labor, means of production, ownership of the means of production, disposal of surplus produced in the productive process, those are fundamental to every class society from the first class society until we reach socialism. But of course, each of those forms of class society have very specific ways of going about that. The way that slavery and slave ownership worked in ancient Greece or ancient Rome is not the same as the way in which aristocratic land ownership and the peasantry worked in medieval Europe, and none of that is the same as modern class society. So um, Marx was interested in those general characteristics, but he was always a thinker who wanted to be able to apply general concepts to specific, or what he called, following Hegel, German philosopher Hegel, concrete circumstances. And the first moment of making that general picture concrete for us is to have a look at how this works in capitalist society. One of the features of capitalist society is the radical dispossession of the lower classes from control over any means of production. The word proletariat that Marx used to describe the working class literally means those people whose only possession is their children. They own no land. Even medieval peasants could own or rent land. The enclosure system, driving the peasantry off the land, sucking them into urban centres, was one of the fundamental building blocks of capitalist society, one of the fundamental moments of the creation of a landless, propertyless mass of workers. So the characteristic of the lower orders in capitalist society is complete separation from the means of production. The means of production are exclusively held by capitalists of varying sizes, from the small corner shop to Lockheed Martin. But what has they all have in common is that they own capital, and working class people do not. That doesn't alter the fact that it is the labor of working class people that produces value in the society. The only way in any society in which value can be attached to anything is because it has human labor involved in it, whether that's picking blackberries or manufacturing BMWs. It all requires some degree of human labor, and that's what makes it valuable. So labor was absolutely central to the creation of value. Capital, owning capital, having the capacity to employ wage labor, was a mechanism by which the value created by labor, by work, can be appropriated by another class. And that happens in this way, that every propertyless worker has to go to an owner of capital in order to receive a wage. That wage isn't determined by the value of what they produce in a working day. That wage is determined by how much it costs them to subsist day to day, week to week, month to month. That's all that the capitalist is required to pay them. All that he wants from them is their ability to return to work, capable of working the next day, the next week, the month. But in the course of a day or a week or a month, the value that a worker creates can exceed the amount of subsistence that they need. So, labor in this sense is for the capitalist like any other commodity in capitalist society. You pay as low a price as you can get away with, and you exploit the ownership of that labor to the fullest extent you can get away with. In this sense, of course, labor is a unique commodity. If you buy a washing machine, it just wears out over a certain number of washes, years, weeks, whatever. If you buy a spade, it just wears out after a certain amount of use. It's passing on its value incrementally to those things that it's involved in producing potatoes, your washing, whatever. But labor isn't like that. Labor can be worked beyond its price. Labor is paid what's necessary to reproduce it, but in the course of a working day, it can be made to work more intensively, or it can be made to work longer, and therefore it can produce more value than the value of the housing, clothing, food that it needs in order to survive. And it's that unique capacity to produce what Marx called surplus value, that is value over and above what's necessary to reproduce labor, that is the source of profit. It's the capitalist's control of capital which allows them to employ labor, and they have to pay labor only what's necessary for it to subsist, but it can be worked for longer or harder than the value that's necessary for it to subsist, and the additional value that it produces in that time is surplus value, and therefore the origin of profit. And that's the technical meaning of exploitation in Marxist economics, that labor is paid less than the value it produces. And because it's paid less than the value it produces, it is exploited. So you can't exploit a washing machine or a car or a steam engine. That can only pass on to the things that it's used to produce the same amount of value that was stored up in it by the labor which produced it. So laborers out there in washing machine factories are, if you like, embedding a certain amount of effort, time, labor in that machine. That machine runs for a certain number of years. The things that it does, it produces, it passes on a similar amount of value to them. Labor is different. Labor can be worked harder and longer than what it costs to buy, and the difference between what it costs to buy and what it's able to produce is surplus value, and the reason why we describe labor under capitalism as exploited. So that is Marx's so-called labor theory of value, and the origin of profit in the capitalist system. So that's one fundamental kind of strand of Marx's economic thought. But so far, we've just discussed the world as if it's like one big factory, as if there were just kind of one giant employer and one giant workforce, and a certain level of abstraction for certain purposes. That's fair enough. But of course, the actual capitalist system isn't like that. It isn't just one big factory or even one big state enterprise. Even very large nationalized enterprises aren't alone in their markets. The other absolutely critical dimension of Marx's thought was to understand how capitalism works as a competitive system. And this is absolutely fundamental. There's a very short phrase that Marx uses for this. He says, capital can only exist as many capitals. Now, as with a lot of Marx's work, there's a huge amount of meaning condensed into that very simple phrase. Capital can only exist as many capitals. In other words, this is an inherently, structurally, institutionally competitive system. And if you look around your room, any product that you touch is the product of a competitive market. The food that we buy comes from a competitive market composed of Sainsbury's and Morrison's and Lidl and Aldi and so on and so on. The petrol you buy at the pumps is a competitive product produced by Shell or BP or Exxon or Agip. The computers that you buy are either Apple or Hewlett Packard, on and on and on. Every single market, including the labor market, where people compete for jobs, everything is a competitive market. There's no overseeing eye. There's no United Nations of the market, which keeps it all in order. The state plays some kind of role within national borders of regulating capitalism, but the world system as a whole is a competing system of nation states. So there is no Zeus looking down on the world of competitive markets from the heights of Olympus and governing the system. It is uh, a uncontrolled competitive system, and this has a number of very, very important consequences for Marx. First of all, there is absolutely nothing stopping the system going into periodic economic crises. Just think about it for a minute. Think about the car market. There's a certain amount of demand out there for motor cars, but no individual firm knows what portion of that market is theirs. If the market for cars is 100%, Ford doesn't know that it's got 20%, and Nissan's got 10%, and Volkswagen has 15%, and therefore they should all produce their percentage of the market and fulfill it. That isn't how it works. And even if they knew that, they wouldn't behave like that. Because in a competitive system, they're all trying to grab a bigger share of the market than their competitors. So the market is an inherently uncontrolled competitive environment in which the cycle of production is that people begin to produce and begin to try and compete and begin to try and take larger shares of their market. Inevitably, they are the competitive outcome of that multitude of firms attempting to all do the same thing will very likely be either overproduction or underproduction. That the system will either overproduce or underproduce. That means it will either grow exponentially until it exceeds demand and then crash, or it will underproduce, begin to recoup the dynamic of competing for the market. Everybody tries to grab their share, and the same chaos emerges once again. So, a system in which capital can only exist as many capitals is an inherently uncontrolled competitive environment in which overproduction and underproduction are absolutely inevitable. The other thing about competition, of course, is that it enforces exploitation. Um, Even if there were even nice capitalists can't afford to behave nicely, even if their desire and Robert Owen and some of the utopian socialists thought like this, that they could, within their factory, they could have better conditions for the workers, and some conditions were better than others, but uh, whatever the intentions of individual capitalists, they are bound into a competitive system. If their competitors lower wages, they've got a choice of either lowering wages or going bust. If their competitors lengthen the working day, they've got a choice of either lengthening the working day themselves or accepting lower profits and eventually going bust. A competitive system forces every element in the system to compete and exploit labor as hard as they possibly can. I mean, this was the graphic example of this, I always think, was during the miners' strike when the argument of the Thatcher government in the 1984-85 miners' strike and of the coal board was to British miners, you've got to work harder and longer for less because Polish coal miners and South African coal miners are outproducing you. Now, all right, we didn't accept that. The miners didn't accept that. We fought for a year, we lost. And indeed, what happened was that miners in this country did work harder and longer for less with less of them. And then in 1992, the government came back again and said, hey guys, guess what? The Polish and the South African are working even harder and even longer for less, and therefore your industry isn't competitive, so we're closing it. That was the international dynamic of competition enforcing levels of exploitation inside particular units of capital. So competition means an inherently crisis-ridden system and an inherently and dynamically exploitative system. And competition like this does a third thing as well. It enforces capital accumulation. You know, Marx famously said that for the capitalists, accumulation is the Moses and the prophets. In other words, this is the absolute religious law of capitalism is that it must accumulate capital for the very same reason that it has to, irrespective of the desires or morality or kind-heartedness of the capitalist, has to exploit labor. It has to accumulate capital. In other words, it has to try and introduce more productive machinery in order to compete effectively on the market. Now, within a unit of capital, this is a sensible thing to do. But one of the great insights of Marx is that in a competitive system, which is an uncontrolled system, what is rational inside one unit of capital becomes irrational when it's generalized across many units of capital. So, for instance, the reason it's irrational, I'll come to the reason, the reason that it's enforced is the same reason, because of competition. Think of the introduction of automatic checkout in supermarkets. As soon as one supermarket introduces this piece of technology, which gets rid of a whole bunch of wage labor, automates a process that was employing labor before, gradually every supermarket has to do the same thing or lose out. For the first supermarket that does it, it increases its profits. But by the time every supermarket has done it, all that's happened across the system is that dead labor, i.e., stored up wealth in machinery, has been substituted for living labor. And as we've seen, it is living labor which produces surplus value, which produces profits. So, what is rational and what produces a profit when it's done in a single firm first, when it's generalized across all firms over time, begins to depress the profit rate by substituting dead labor, accumulated labor, labor stored up in capital, in machineries, factories, so forth and so on, for living labor. And this is what Marx called the tendency of the rate of profit to decline. Over time, because the system is competitively driven to replace labor with capital, it begins to undercut the sources of profit within its own system. Now, there are ways in which, both with cyclical crises and with this long-term tendency of the rate of profit to decline, there are ways in which capitalism can compensate for this. And the way it compensates for it is by literally destroying capital. That's what an economic crisis does. Factories close, machinery stands idle or is wasted and scrapped. Whole acres of cars outside car factories go unsold. Food rots in the warehouse. Value is destroyed. And this is what happens in a cyclical boom and slump. At the bottom of the slump, capital values are destroyed. Firms go bankrupt. Whole areas of economic production lie idle until the system can begin to recuperate and the competitive drive forces it to begin to rebuild itself. So that's one way in which capital overcomes the problem that it creates for itself by substituting capital for labor. Another way that it does this very effectively is in wars. One of the reasons why the longest single period of unhindered capitalist growth was the long post-war boom is because it was a post-war boom. Huge amounts of capital have been destroyed in the most destructive war that humanity has ever seen. And the system had, if you like, cleansed itself of over accumulation from the previous phase, the phase that had produced the slump of the 1929 and the depression of the 1930s. So the system destroys the capital that it's overproduced, resets the balance between living labor and dead labor, and begins again the whole same process. You can do something of the same thing with arms production, because although if there isn't a war, those armaments don't get destroyed in a conflict, they nevertheless arms production, like luxury production for capitalists, has a unique characteristic. It never re-enters the system as a means of production. If you produce a car, it gets sold on the market, it helps people get to work, it allows them to go on holiday and recuperate their labor, its value is fed back into the system. If you produce a tank, it sits out on Salisbury Plain till it rusts or it becomes redundant and is replaced by another tank. It never re-enters the capitalist cycle of production. So it's literally a waste product. So you're literally destroying capital as if it had been blown up in a war, but it's just been standing there and not doing anything in terms of adding to the productive value of the capitalist system. So it isn't just that there's pressure in the system for the a rate of profit to decline, it's that there's also pressure in the system for these compensatory measures to act in destructive ways. So Marx's whole theory is the pressure that there is on the rate of profit because of the substitution of capital for labor, but also the destructive ways, slumps, wars, arms production, that the system deals with this problem. So I think we're coming up to time. So to summarize, the fundamental category of Marx is labor. It is only labor that produces wealth. Capital is simply stored up labor, which is passing on incrementally its value to the next product. Only human labor produces surplus value, and this is the source of profits and the reason why the system is accurately and scientifically described as an exploitative system. In real life, this process takes place in a competitive environment, which both enforces exploitation and enforces technical capital accumulation. But capital accumulation over time substitutes dead labor, as Marx called it, for living labor, and this exacerbates the tendencies to crisis inside the system, which can only be resolved by the destruction of capital in slumps and wars and arms production. So those are some of the fundamental ideas in Marxist economics.